Let me continue the broadening of this discussion by asking about the applications of genetic engineering to poverty problems, to problems of, say, poor farmers in Africa and developing countries where there's a great need for a second and more sustainable green revolution, which didn't enter into Alison's paper, although from the ethical point of view, it's probably a more important issue than whether or not America gets to export agricultural products or not. Would people like to address that issue? Because I think there are a lot of interesting things going on that would interest the audience.
Well, just briefly, I just did a week-long seminar where African lawyers all came to Michigan State to talk, from 50 different countries, to talk about should we adopt biotech. And I was stunned by the number of myths from Harvard-educated environmental ministers who say we are pretty sure biotech corn causes sterility, all girl children, pigs die. I mean, there's a list that went on and on. And after they heard some scientific presentations and actually ate BT corn at the end of the week, we formed a LinkedIn group, and now we're all talking about, well, should biotechnology be used in Africa to feed animals at least, right? Make biofuel perhaps. There's so many things you can do other than just eat it and go sterile, right?
Well, I think we have to make sure, Tom, that we don't propagate those kinds of
Well, yeah, the
arguments.
Minister of Tanzania just came out today saying there's all these myths in my country.
And
Why don't we get all the scientists together and figure out how to tell people what the safety issues are?
there are three good examples, I think, of how technology, biotechnology, genetic engineering of one sort or another could impact on the developing world. One, and they're all three things that haven't yet happened. One is a colleague of ours has been working on a goat that he's engineered the goat to produce phytase in the goat's milk. And for those of you who aren't familiar, phytase is an enzyme that we all have in our saliva, and it's an antimicrobial. Lysozyme. Sorry, wrong pig. Lysozyme. And it's an antimicrobial, and in fact, it is, as a product, it has achieved generally recognized as safe status, right? It's sprayed on the rinds of cheese to prevent bacterial contamination of cheese. And yet that goat project has had to move to Brazil because of a total lack of support from resources in the US to continue the development of that project. A second one is in India, and I don't know Indian geography well enough to be able to tell you exactly where, but there's a part of India where eggplant, brinjal, is grown as a cash crop. And this eggplant is susceptible to borers, like the corn borer. And plant breeders around the world have looked and haven't been able to identify sources of resistance to the borer. And so a collective of organizations came together and put BT into it. And BT, BT is an organic pesticide, for Pete's sakes. I mean, organic growers can apply it. And yet, that has been stopped. No field trials even for the last 2 years because of actually just outright misstatements about the environmental and health consequences of that. And then the third is golden rice. And golden rice is, again, probably this audience, you're all familiar with it. The fact that rice has been engineered to produce provitamin A, the necessary compound that we can then use to produce vitamin A. And and it's been demonstrated that a little over a cup a day of golden rice in a diet would be enough to prevent vitamin A deficiency, which causes something like 2 million deaths a year, 500,000 cases of permanent blindness. And that's all in the developing world. That's not here. That's not Europe. That's in the developing world. And that, I think, directly talks to your point, Charles, about the morals of this.
Well, as a lawyer for farmers, I can say there are more potential clients for me in the developing world by the latest count than there are in the developed countries, or by count of just by head count, more biotech growers in the developing world.
Let me bring up another issue. This has been very illuminating. But it sounds like some of this argument is basically based on a distrust of people, that they can't handle the facts. If they want to know how these things are produced, I would ask two sort of contradictory questions. A, if they want to know how it's produced, why not tell them how it's produced? And second of all, if the First Amendment, conversely, if this First Amendment case about BST milk held that curiosity is not a sufficient reason to force firms to tell how a product is produced, then what's the problem? Legally, what's the problem? So we have an ethical issue. Why shouldn't people know if they want to, even if platoons of scientists say there's no problem? And legally, given that it's no, the courts have decided that they have no right simply to satisfy their curiosity, what's the problem? What are we arguing about?
I'll take the first one.
Go ahead.
If they're interested in that process, they have that option in the marketplace right now. I think where the concern is that there are many, many different processes, and what we're saying now is everybody has to have theirs labelled as whether they use this process or not, even though a small portion of people are demonstrating that interest in the marketplace. And there's legal consequences for mislabeling if you get it wrong, and that's going to have cost consequences. And so I guess to me, the products are in the marketplace right now if you want to avoid that, and we've always had processes be voluntarily labelled. I'm not interested in buying certain processes. I don't want to have my food labelled that it didn't use that process, or it did if it's a process that doesn't concern me, especially if it's going to increase the cost of my food because the manufacturer might get sued if they got it wrong. So that would be my answer to that one.
Well, and the issue that having represented the industry for so many years, one of the first things I say is, first off, consumers get information from a whole variety of sources. Frankly, I get too much information from Wikipedia and Google that's good for me, but I get a lot of information off the label. Then to the extent that you have the label, then you say, well, what do you put on it? And increasingly, for the longest time, the FDA labeling policy really speaks to product safety. One, these products are safe. They wouldn't be on the shelf at all if they were not safe. Let me tell you right now with broad awareness, the knowledge that these products are on the shelf and they're safe. But I think the second thing is when you start saying, well, but I want it labeled specifically for Biotech or for GM. It's like, well, that's good, but there's a slight problem. We've got 300 million Americans. Which information or what tidbit of information do we put on a chiclet box? Do we label for all 300 bits of information at any individual consumer? I'm not saying that they're not entitled to that information. It's just you have to be practical about which information you put on the label. And what FDA and increasingly the courts said is, we recognize the demand for consumer information is so vast. Some of it will come from McCall's magazine, some from New York Times, some from the TV, some from even the label itself. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that there are issues concerning science or specifically consumer health, allergens, nutritional functional change, that when we come to that small limited space on that product, we have to really reserve it in human dignity and deference to the health of our fellow citizens. And that's really what the FDA labeling policy is all about.
Why don't I turn this over now to the audience? We have portable microphones somewhere, and would you please identify yourself and then keep things reasonably brief.
Would you go up to the microphone?
Is the microphone portable, or do they have to go to it?
It would be best if they went to.
Okay, so that is that's the one. Oh, there are two microphones. Please go to the one that's nearest you.
So I guess while we're waiting, I wanted to...
Sir.
Oh, go ahead. I just wanted to note while he's taking the stand, we do have a voluntary GM labeling bill in Congress now, so there is some movement toward voluntary.
Hello, my name is Karil, and I come from France, where is a country where we are not really familiar with GM, and we do not like GM.
And what is your organization, sir?
US Wheat Associates, a pro-GM organization in Washington. So I have to say that I arrived 2 months ago, and I have to change my mind. I was really skeptical about GM. I can't believe that there is no risk for human health, and that we all benefit, and the third world benefit a lot about GM. The only concern I want to address in here that you did not talk about is the environmental consequences in terms of superweed and in terms of decreasing productivity of this crop protection, GM crop protection, to the pest and to the weeds. So don't you think that in 10 years we will have to invent more powerful GM, and we will go on, and the pest and natural illness, we will also be more resistant. So where are we going? When is it stopping?
Are we on the treadmill?
This is where the growers gotta talk, okay? So as growers, we have sought to have a rotation to avoid herbicide-resistant weeds. Europe has kept us from having the Liberty-Link soybean for 10 years until we sued them on the WTO, and finally we can use the Liberty-Link instead of Roundup. It's clear that CAST has also done some good papers. We have a weed scientist here, Phil Solomon, I was involved with about how to avoid herbicide resistance in crops. So there are ways to manage these in rotation, so it's an infinite loop and they never expire.
It's not unique to GM. This has been something, this herbicide tolerance is something that has occurred as long as as farmers have been using herbicides. Rice is a good example today, where they have one herbicide tolerant variety or approach available, tolerance to one herbicide available. It was developed through a mutational program that had nothing to do with GM, and because of the over-reliance and the inability to utilize other herbicides, they're developing weed tolerance to those that herbicide in rice as well. So it's not unique to GM.
It's targeting the Roundup Ready GM.
Well, it gets back to the whole notion that I said, biotech is not a food, it's a process, it's a tool. And it's one of many tools that whether you're into food, into pharmaceuticals, into other aspects of life, you use whatever tools are available. And on the issue of superweed, it's just as these gentlemen have said, you use the best tool. If it's a conventional a pesticide or an insecticide, fine. If it's a biotech one, you use whatever's best to get it, because frankly, at the end of the day, farmers want to use as limited amount of product to make the most amount of product so they can be productive in their own operations.
One of the theme of everything is that GMOs don't have special characteristics and should not be subject to special regulations. You can run that argument backwards. You can say that all the regulations should be looked at again, include not just GMOs, but everybody. So are existing protections of the consumer and the environment sufficient for all of our agricultural products?
Well, Canada certainly regulates everything, including your Clearfield rice you mentioned, that's regulated by Canada. If it's novel, they take a look.
Is that good or bad?
Well, we don't like mission creep in the world. We call mission creep here.
I think if the regulatory system was clear and worked, and it wasn't subject to the politics that we see it today, then that kind of a novel food approach might be just fine. But the fact is that we let politics in, and we let politics affect how the regulatory system works. And so that's a challenge that we've got to deal with too.
Well, if you were king, what changes would you make for that?
It'd all be science-based, and it'd be straightforward.
Well, and one of the things that you talk about politics getting into science, people are out there, particularly the pro-labeling advocates, saying that, well, we've got labeling in 60-odd countries, they've seen the light. And it's like, yeah, but I don't know one country that really has a practical, functioning labeling system where you see choice on the shelf with the diversity of products. And frankly, you can go to Europe, you can go to Japan, you can go to Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Brazil, Saudi Arabia. I could list all 60 countries. I don't know a functioning labeling program around, because it gets to the whole issue of a politically defined labeling regime that really doesn't operate or practice well. And so the food companies just stay away from it. It's not consistent, stable, and reliable, and it's been politically jerked.
If we were going to label, we would say this is the corn that doesn't have the mycotoxin. BT corn doesn't have mycotoxin. I mean, at farmers markets that actually occurs. I have growers who say, I've got this stuff, no spray and none of that mold. Okay, and it's BT, and they say BT, they don't say GMO. And some people say, oh, I don't want it, like in Wisconsin particularly. And other parts of the world, they'll Google on their smartphone and say, well, okay, that seems like it works for me.
Are there more questions? Okay, Karen, go ahead. Nobody else wants the floor, so you got it.
Oftentimes at dinner time, I sit and chat with my family about what's going on at the school, and they've shown a lot of the headlines and storylines around the issue of biotech. Again, a very narrow, skewed discussion on focused on food alone. And I talked to my children about where biotech is used so broadly in our lives, and they said they spring up the whole issue of genes mixing. And I raised to my son, I said, honey, I think your father and I mixed genes here. But it speaks to the lack of understanding of science in our homes. You know, so we have to have that baseline understanding that, you know, when you have a blood transfusion, you're mixing blood from someone else. And that blood transfusion has helped to save so many people. It's biotechnology in a different way. We have a very refined and defined and legalistic definition for this conversation, but this conversation is so narrow and skewed and frankly perturbed. How do we get beyond this? I don't like what we had in California or frankly what we had in Vermont or even some of the legislatures. It's narrow, it's politically driven, and it doesn't enhance consumer understanding. And at the end of the day, that's what we want.
And if you were in charge, what would you do?
I'd have a robust conversation. I'd start talking to, I mean, one of the things, how many of you have Thursday evening margaritas? None of you? All right, I have Monday, no, but happy hour margaritas.
Okay.
You wouldn't have a margarita if you didn't have GM. The agave shortage in Mexico is so short, and they've got a blight of agave down there, that to meet the demand for agave in the United States, which is the plant for tequila, you have to have GM. And if we're going to keep the agave at that robust level to meet American demand, you're going to have to start looking at further sources of biotech.
Same for American orange juice. The orange crops are suffering from a devastating problem down in Florida. So Google that. We're not going to have orange juice from America if we don't adopt a genetic approach.
We're no longer the largest #1 exporter of wheat because of the large rust impact in the United States. Could we address this large crop that's been destroyed in the United States and that's food waste? We can no longer get at this food waste.
Toxin too, by the way.
Exactly.
It's a
Well,
volatile.
then let me come back to the question we started with. What are we afraid of? If the answer is we're afraid of activists and we have all these arguments on the side of GM, what are we sitting back for? And that's what I don't understand, this terror of Greenpeace.
Well, I think actually there's two aspects here, and as an academic scientist, I think one of the big problems is the regulatory costs that are triggered by the use of this recombinant DNA technology are so high that you can't get products to market unless you are a large multinational firm. So the people that are working on the genetically engineered orange problem, people that are working on a myriad of other problems, especially in the animal kingdom, aren't large multinational firms, and we can produce very societally beneficial products, but we don't have $100 million to get them to market, and so they languish, and it's very difficult to get them to market. And the reason we have such a very expensive regulatory regime is because the groups opposed to the technology keep insisting there's all these safety risks that have to be looked for, even though we've had 20 years of scientific experience that shows there's actually no difference between the products produced. And so at this stage, a rational society would say, we've got a weight of scientific evidence now. We don't need to do a $100 million regulatory package on every single genetically engineered product that comes to market. What we need to do is look at anything novel that product has that might be a safety concern and not focus on this technology that was used to produce that novel product. And I think that's what's missing, and that's what's stopping the technology getting used for societally redeeming purposes.
Any further thoughts from the audience, please? Yes, please.
Question, kind of.
Identify yourself.
Sure, I'm John McMurdy. I'm from USAID. Work on a lot of the projects that Mark referenced. My question is, so I've seen the label. I think it's in Australia, and it's very much a kind of in a standard back of the label, not the salt and crossbones that's being pushed in the US. I'm curious, I'm just guessing by your accent, if kind of what the market reaction has been to labeling in Australia, if there has any been actually consumer segregation, if people actually flip it over and look at it, or if it's just spend a lot of money for nothing.
I'm probably the wrong person to ask. I know that sounds silly, but I've lived here for 30 years, and
Okay.
GM had come into Australia at that time. I know that there has been some, and I think it's proportional to how much kind of pressure they get in the marketplace to remove those products. And I know that there have been some brands that have removed genetically engineered sugar. I think there was recently I was reading something about that. in response again to marketplace pressure. And I think all countries are, if you've got that going on, are subject to it. And there's only 2 supermarket chains basically in Australia. And if what happens in one kind of triggers the other one so that they keep up with the Joneses, and so if enough pressure can get applied, you can kind of get the products changed. But in answer to your exact question, I'm not sure what the answer is down there.
And just to be clear, marketplace pressure here are lawyers enabled by these laws to sue. So for example, in Brazil, which did the EU-style oil is going to be labeled, nobody could test anything for it. So what do? They bring big lawsuits, demand all the documents going through the whole chain of commerce, and all the emails going back for years, and they try to figure out, did you ever use the GMO? And they go all the way through all that, and it's very, very costly. So what the companies do, they have to roll over and say, okay, we're going to have to source, better non-GMO because they found somebody in there used a 5% seed and it's a 0.9 or so.
Well,
You get sued and everybody pays a lot of money. Did anybody benefit that?
Well, I was in a meeting recently and this testing firm promoted the fact that he's now at testing at a part per trillion. Part per trillion. Can you imagine that? Well, if you're a company that labels, whether it's a consumer product or a food product, you have to have confidence in the statements that you make about in the label on your product, whether it contains a chemical or not, whether it contains ingredient or not, something that you want or you don't want. And so you have to make it truthful, non-misleading. To support that, if you can't test it, even at a part per trillion level, you have to trace and document. In global supply chains, how do you manage that? And who pays for it? If I'm tracing, all the things in a grocery store, for that matter, in a department store, because remember, biotechnology is used in all aspects of our life. Well, shouldn't we label for all biotech in all aspects of our life, not just food, and trace it as well? Do we want to go there? Why don't we just have a big, robust conversation instead? And if you don't want to use it, go buy organic or look for other labels that provide you that choice. You should have that choice. You should have that knowledge. But do we really want to create an infrastructure based on myth and error?
Well, we also have new plant breeding methods, and your animal breeding methods being used in plants. Those are not our DNA. They're not subject to GM labeling in any of these laws that are all now out of date, right?
Well, there's question about that.
Yeah.
And I think that goes back to Charles's question too. One of the concerns about a mandatory label based on process is that, okay, so that's the process as it's defined today.
Yeah.
But what happens tomorrow and the year after as all of the new technologies come along? And now you've got ongoing expense of, is this the same technology? Does it fall under the same label requirements? Yada, yada, yada. So,
I think we've hit quitting time. I want to thank the panel. I want to thank Alison for this excellent presentation. I want to thank the audience, and I think it's time to go to the reception.